I often spend, when I have a devotional or once in a while study like this, I'm not always the first one to volunteer. Sometimes I'll let someone like Jeff or Dan take it first if I can get away with it. But when I have something coming up, I oftentimes think and ruminate quite a bit before pen ever hits paper. And usually by the time the pen hits the paper, I've got a pretty good idea in my head what things are going to look like. And I knew I had these 2 Wednesdays coming up. And I had 2 different topics in mind, and they were completely different. Had nothing in common with each other. And I'd been ruminating, cogitating, whatever you might call it. And last Wednesday evening, something in Paul's class really struck me, and it pushed me over the edge toward the one that I was originally inclined not to do. So what we're going to do over these 2 weeks, it's going to be a series. So I'm going to get started this evening, and then hopefully finish up next week. And I entered it with some trepidation because it's such a large topic, and it can be difficult at some points if I'm not clear in the message that it could be taken the wrong way. So my hope is that as we study, that we'll keep in mind that what we have to say is coming directly from the Scriptures, and the rest of it, I'll make sure to tell you if it's coming from me. So it also comes about from some of the recent, I feel in this congregation that the time is ripe. There's a lot of similar mindset. We've been really building on our vision and our mission statements and allowing that to take mold in our hearts. The last devotional I did was called Breaking Barriers, and it was based in John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. And so before we really get going into this study, I want to read John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. And this is Jesus speaking. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. I've often heard in our prayers, or sometimes in studies or sermons, and not necessarily just here, but anywhere I've been, we always talk about worshiping in spirit and in truth. And this is where that comes from. And it's something that's very dear to the heart of many Christians. It's a very important thing to worship in spirit and truth. And as we go through this study, eventually where we want to get to by the end of next week is hopefully a better handle on the different facets of that very thing, worshiping in spirit and in truth. And ultimately, gaining a better understanding of who we are. It's easy to come to church. It's easy to be affiliated with a church, any congregation in particular. And we think we know who we are. We think we know how we identify ourselves. But maybe it doesn't have the same meaning as it does to somebody else. And maybe after a while, we get a little bit complacent. And as Gary often says, we are a forgetful people. So that does play into it. And sometimes we want to change things, or maybe we don't want to change things, but why would you change or not change? What's the rationale behind it? And so hopefully by the end of this study, we'll have a better understanding of who we are as Christians and what defines us as Christians and as the Lord's church, ultimately. So the other thing is, what sets us apart from what we generally term as the secular world, other denominations that are out there? I think when we send outreaches at my work to fill jobs, one of the sections are what we've got for churches, and there's like 12 to 14 denominations that you can choose from. So we usually advertise that to say, hey, there's a wide variety, please come to Salmon. That's usually on the format that, when you send outreaches to try to recruit people to come here to Salmon to work. We should understand who we are and where we're going and what sets us apart from other people. Why are we special? So ultimately, by the end of this, what I want to get us to start thinking about is who we ought to be as well. So who we are now and where do we want to be and who should we be? Not just as individuals, but collectively as a congregation. In order to understand that, we do need to go, I think it's important to understand the history of the church. And oftentimes when we are studying with somebody or studying ourselves, one of the things we go to, there's usually some sort of chart, and it talks about the beginning of the church, and then it'll show all of the branches of denominations that come henceforth, and then it kind of explains, who we are a little bit at the end. So what I'd like to do is start with a brief history, and I will call out some names for people I'll probably just go, in order as I see you, for reading out some scriptures, and that way I won't be the only one talking. But when did the church begin? It began in AD 33, right? I think we can all pretty much agree to that. It began in AD 33 in the city of Jerusalem on what is commonly known to us as the day of Pentecost, and more commonly known then because it was a practiced festival. Pentecost, or Pentecoste, as it was spoken in the Greek, it's, as most of us know, it's the 50th day from Christ's death and resurrection. That festival of Pentecost is really the 50th day from Passover, which was the Feast of First Fruits. So these are festivals that were practiced by the ancient Jews. And as the timing would have it, Pentecost was also 10 days following Christ's ascension. So remember, he rose from the grave on the third day and stayed on the earth, and so for 40. So when he ascended, 10 days later was when Pentecost happened. So you can go back to Acts chapter 1 and 2 to read that. You can also go to Luke chapter 24. And for time's sake, we're not going to read those verses tonight. So, Dan, would you mind turning to Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19? And Connie, would you mind? I'll go to Jeff. I'll start from the opposite side. Colossians 1, verse 18. And go ahead, Dan, when you're ready.
You said 15?
16, sorry, Matthew 16.
16, 17?
Mm-hmm.
17 and 18?
Yep.
And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for your flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it."
Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy.
So from these two verses, we know that Jesus built the church. He started it. He was the beginning and the end of it. And nothing can destroy it. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Jesus didn't just build the church, he built one church, right? Jill, would you mind turning to Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6? I'm sorry.
He don't have his glasses. I don't know if I can read it.
Here you go.
Oh, that's okay. And we'll do a couple more, and then Roger, would you mind 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12?
1 Corinthians what, 12?
Chapter 12,
12.
verses 12 and 13.
So you want 5 and 6?
Ephesians 4, 4 through 6, yep.
4 through 6. There is one body and one spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. One God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all.
And Roger?
For as the body is one, and hath many members, and all the members of the body being many are one body, so also is Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether bond or free, and were all made to drink of the one Spirit.
He built one church. The scriptures are clear that we are one. He didn't just build it, he also purchased it. Hubie, would you mind turning? You have your glasses, right? Okay. Would you mind turning to Acts chapter 20, verse 28? Yep, go ahead.
Acts 20:28.
28, right?
Chapter 20, verse 28.
Take heed unto yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit hath made you bishops, to feed the church of the Lord, which he purchased with his own blood.
Jesus purchased the church with his own blood. He purchased it. When we go to the store, or when we go anywhere and purchase anything, who owns it once it's been purchased? The one who purchased it, right? If you buy something, it is yours. If someone else buys something, it is theirs. Jesus purchased the church. It is his. And if you were to flip to Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 23, I'll read. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Between what Hubie just read and that there, it's very clear that Jesus is not only head of the church, but he owns it. It belongs to him. So this is the beginning of our history as a church. Jesus built it. He built only one. He purchased it and thereby owns it. So, that said, a few hundred years passed by after the church was established. In the year 325, something came up called the Council of Nicaea. That really marked the beginning of what we might call denominationalism. It actually marked the beginning of Catholicism as well. Though, if you were to look up Catholicism, they obviously claim to go back to AD 33, right? But a lot of the traditions and the creeds that you see in Catholicism started from the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. That Council of Nicaea took place in what is modern-day Turkey. There was a council of bishops, if you will, that were called together by Emperor Constantine I of Rome. And there were just over 300 people that attended that council. From what I read, about 318. And when you talk about them being called together, they were convoked together. It was by order of the emperor. So these bishops were ordered by the emperor to convene. There were many different topics, and honestly, a full study of that Council of Nicaea, which resulted in what is called the Nicene Creed, is really a study in and of itself. But some of the topics, included the nature of Christ, the celebration of Passover, ordination of eunuchs, prohibition of kneeling on Sundays, as well as from kneeling on Easter, the validity of baptisms by heretics, lapsed Christians, and other sundry matters. The result, obviously, was what I just mentioned, the Nicene Creed, composed of 20 canons. What is a canon? It's just a law that was invoked by that council. So this religious council invoked these laws, which are called canons. So that when you hear the term canon, that's what they're talking about, is a religious council that basically authorized and passed these religious laws.
Glenn?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, when you use the term bishop,
Mm-hmm.
was this wasn't a Jewish bishop, was it?
No, this was of the Christian faith. Now keep in mind, the Council of Nicaea, even before that, there were already divisions happening within the church. And so some of those topics that I just named, people were having differences of opinion over basically how to worship. And so because of those divisions, and there was a growing popularity of Christianity in the Roman Empire at that time, the emperor himself decided to gather at that time bishops in the sense that we read of in the New Testament, but they could have already, I don't have all of the history of which congregation and from where they came from. But they were basically people of high standing, and they were called bishops at that time. And you already by that time had the development of what some people call high church, which is of more of an elite category. They were already wearing fancy garb and were already had traditions of men in place. So from that sense, it was basically a calling, and they were convoked, so they were ordered to gather from different parts of the empire. And that Nicene Creed, they also kind of had a synodal epistle, which synodal simply means that it was a result of a gathering, a religious gathering related to the church. And I'm going to use that term, the church, loosely. So if you were to look at Catholicism today and to look through their history, you'll see that they've had some 266 popes. And in the year 1870, the Pope was actually declared infallible. And there's still debate even among Catholics today about that. So, but the idea being, and the Council of Nicaea was only the first of a number of councils that were held in the first centuries. So that one just marked the beginning of several that actually followed that. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it. But it's important to know that the year 325, there were already divisions happening, and the idea was that they would have this gathering, and they would come to some sort of resolution on that and make it the same for everybody. But it became a creed, a man-made creed. And there were other canons that followed, other laws, 20 laws. They talked about kneeling on a Sunday and stuff like that. So keep in mind, it got very detailed, and I won't get into all the details. We don't have time tonight for that sort of a study. But just know that is a mark in history that we can identify as a turning point regarding denominationalism itself. So that actually ruled the day for many centuries. That and the following councils after the Council of Nicaea, you see very soon afterwards that Catholicism itself became very well established, had great influence over many of the events of history even. And in the current population of what we might deem Christianity from a worldly sense, they make up about 50% of the population of those that call themselves Christian. Moving forward to the year 1517, something very important happened then. A man by the name of Martin Luther from the country of Germany posted his 95 Theses. And that was posted on the Castle Church in Wittenberg, which he was also affiliated with. Those 95 Theses, in a lot of ways, challenged the authority of the Pope. And of course, we've had many centuries up until this point of Catholicism reigning the day. So this was a big deal to reach out for religious freedom. And even though they were called Lutherans, and Martin Luther really never wanted any of the people that agreed with him to be called Lutherans, that's what ended up happening, because as is common with people who are known as being founders of religious movements, that movement usually is called by the last name of its, quote, founder as a derogatory term. So most people, such as Martin Luther, probably didn't appreciate that. But what were his main points? What was this division over? Well, he was saying that the Bible is essential authority, and is a primary authority to run a Christian's life. And that questions the Pope directly. The Pope had a lot to say up until this point, and that's a threat to the established system. He also preached salvation by faith. He debated propositions with questions regarding indulgences that were placed, which in Catholicism you could be given a certificate to reduce your eternal punishment. So you get this certificate that says that your eternal punishment is lessened if maybe you give some money. So he debated that. He fought back on that, and of course that takes away from the money bags, and it hurts when the money is gone. So that was a direct threat to the establishment. Historically, this was the first branch that started Protestantism. So, all the other branches of what is known as the Protestant, side of things, anything that's not Catholic, this was the beginning of that. In 1521, just 4 short years later, he was excommunicated. So it means he has no part to do with the Catholic Church. And a few years later, by 1530, there were 28 articles of Lutheranism that was presented to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the churches of the Augsburg Confession. And again, you can identify any numbers that you want, but there were 28 at this time. And today, there are between 70 to 90 million people who identify themselves as Lutherans in the world. So that was 1517. Not too many years later, 1534, jumping from Germany now to England, we all remember King Henry VIII. He was a rather infamous one. Well, he split from the Roman Catholic Church too. And why did he do that? Because the Pope refused to grant him an annulment. So it was a very, very straightforward reason. And as a result, the Church of England was developed. And by the year 1604, of course, we have the King James Version. There were other versions that were being worked on soon after that split. But the King James Version does remain the most widely used and most popular version even today. And in the world, there are approximately 110 million Anglicans, which are of the Church of England. Also, at about this time, we jump over to Switzerland. And we have an individual by the name of John Calvin. He was French, born in France, died in Switzerland. And he came, and what he founded is what later became known as Presbyterian. We've all heard of that. And a couple of the main points of John Calvin, he came up with something called predestination for salvation. Grace alone saves, not just works, not works alone. He spoke of the sovereignty of God, the depravity of humanity, and, of course, predestination went along with that. Let me explain what total depravity is. In very simple terms, total depravity means that all human actions are inherently displeasing to God, whether those actions and those works are outwardly good or bad. So it's just an inherent flaw that all of our works as humans are flawed and displeasing to God. Predestination, in simple terms, means that all events are willed by God. So that includes salvation. Our fate is predetermined. And there have been many, many debates over how does that affect free will? And even Presbyterians have had internal debates and tried to explain that as well. But note that those are the primary points: grace alone and predestination, and that total depravity. And a lot of people, when we talk about those points of what John Calvin preached on, call it, quote, Calvinism. But that said, today of the Presbyterians, there are about 40 million in the world. That again was about in the same year as the 1530s. Moving forward a few more years, starting in the mid-1500s, so 1550 to 1608 region, so we've got several decades, we had an individual from England by the name of Robert Brown. And what he founded is what became later known as a congregational church. And what was preached by Robert Brown was the right and responsibility of each congregation, so to effectively run their own affairs. So up until this point, there's always been some sort of centralized, especially, we still have Catholics at the time still being an establishment. And we're only just a few years, really just a few decades into what you might call the split of Protestantism. And so you have obviously with Catholicism, you've got the Vatican, you've got the Pope, you've got a very centralized system. And this, again, was a push for religious freedom. They wanted to be able to have each congregation run their own affairs. And do we not stress that among the church today? They were what became known as Puritans. They were a very congregationally based sect. Puritans were basically Calvinists who, if I can use that term, who wanted to further reform the Church of England. And you also did have straight up, the Calvinist sort of view. They abolished wedding rings, for example. They got rid of organ music, as well as other issues that they dealt with were kneeling to commune, using the term priest, as well as making the cross sign. So the Puritans, which were a huge influence in the early years of our country here in the United States, were very congregationally minded. They wanted to be able to run their own affairs. It was all about religious freedom. A couple hundred years, actually, just a couple years later, so 1607 to 1612, we run into a very familiar sounding term. It's called Baptist. And we can trace the Baptist movement to a man named John Smythe in Holland. And by the way, going back to congregationalism, what is identified as congregational it's pretty minor. It's about 5 million population today. So the Baptist movement was founded in Holland in the early 1600s as well. They agreed with Martin Luther that Scripture is the sole authority of God. So again, it's this continued challenge of the establishment system and of having popes and priests that are over others, over congregations, over widespread areas. They had this thing called sola fide, which means salvation by faith. And we talk a lot about that in a lot of our studies and preaching. This is also where it came from. They did also preach on a personal accountability to God. So it's unlikely that they would have supported these certificates that reduced the eternal punishment. Baptists also recognized baptism. And by baptism, at that time, it meant immersion. They also recognized communion as well. So the Lord's Supper. So those were some of the primary features, if you will, of the beginning of that movement. And today, of those that identify with Baptists, are approximately 100 million. Moving forward 100 years into the early 1700s, and by that I mean in the 1730s, we have a man by the name of John Wesley of England. And he started what is known as the Methodist Church today. It wasn't just John himself. There were others, including Charles Wesley, and they basically started meeting and having Bible studies and became part of what was called a revival movement, if you will. And it started at the Oxford Church in England. So it's very, very, very England-centered. The interesting thing about the Methodists is they spread very quickly in a short amount of time. They had very vigorous missionary work. And they were a little less Calvinistic in their doctrine. They did speak that all may be saved. And so they got away from that predestination concept a little bit more. They did still include traditions for what is known as high church, but they also had a low church, which means that they appealed to the lower levels of society. You're just your everyday worker. And even those who couldn't read or write were being spread the message to, and they themselves were spreading the message. So the missionary work came from all levels of society, not just from the upper echelons. And so having that lower and working class appeal has probably aided very much in its rapid spread at the time. Among some of the other things, they were very, the term Methodist, they were very methodical in, how they lived their lives. A lot of the term teetotaler is something that they were very much in favor of. They basically prohibited gambling, and they had regular attendance and observance of, First Fridays. And so, the Friday fast, I'm sorry. So they fasted on Fridays. And so they had a very rigid lifestyle. They were very controlled of themselves. And today, we see approximately 60 to 80 million people who identify themselves as Methodist. I'm not covering every denomination there is. I'm just going through some of the main. And I am over time, unfortunately. But in 1830, we'll start next week with Joseph Smith and the LDS, and we will finish off by getting into the Restoration movement next week.